Before we get into this discussion, it occurs to me that one of the things that we ought to be looking for today is to deal with a situation that I think so far in Egypt certainly has created more questions than answers. And perhaps some of the questions that we can address today would be the following. Principally, can the USA expect the lives and livelihoods of religious minorities to improve under a government that now seems to be run jointly by an Islamist president and the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces? And should the United States condition financial aid to the new regime based on guarantees of religious freedom? Now, so far, this particular administration has seemed to go in the opposite direction. One of the outcomes of the hearing last year in front of the Lantos Commission and the Helsinki Commission was that Congress sent a message to this particular administration conditioning aid to the emerging government in Egypt, which said the $1.5 billion must be given in installments and must, to some degree, be conditioned on bettering human rights, particularly the rights of religious minorities. As you probably know by now, the Secretary of State waived that condition and sent the money to Egypt without any conditions whatsoever. So if there are new guarantees, how do we measure them? That is another question that I think we have to know, because so far examples of religious tolerance and pluralism, let alone freedom, have been virtually non-existent in that part of the world. Coptic Christians, Assyrians, Maronites, Jews, minority Muslim sects, even secularists have suffered indignities, injustice, and all too often physical brutality and death. And so we have to ask ourselves as well, what can we expect international organizations to do in this struggle? Principally, the United Nations. As you may know, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation is currently, with full complicity by the United States State Department, trying to pursue a strategy that would enact blasphemy laws around the world that would essentially make speaking out against Islam a crime, that would perhaps criminalize the ability to speak out about the persecution of religious minorities, such as Coptic Christians. We have to ask ourselves, if we do wish to change this policy towards emerging regimes and demand some kind of accountability on religious persecution, how much time do we have before this window closes? Those are some of the questions that I think we will begin to address, hopefully on this panel today, and also going forward, members of Congress and hopefully members of the administration will begin to address as well.
Why and how are the Copts important to Egypt? The answer is simple. They are a vital, integral, and inseparable part of the fabric of Egyptian history, society, economy, and contemporary life. They are not merely a fading curiosity of Egypt's historical past, although they are a rich part of that history and deserve to be acknowledged as such in Egypt's school textbooks, media, and public discourse. They are not merely a tangent, a side topic to be discussed after all the rest of Egypt's looming crises have somehow miraculously been resolved. The status and success of Egypt's Copts are important now more than ever. They should be important to the United States and its leaders because it is in our strategic and merely human interest to see our friends and allies in Egypt prosper. We should be concerned about the Copts not because they are more important, more deserving, or more in need of freedom and dignity than their Muslim compatriots. Rather, it is because Egypt's flirtation with democracy cannot succeed, will not succeed, unless its Christians, that is the Copts, are given full and absolute equality, citizenship, religious freedom, constitutional inclusion, and an end to all legal impunity for those who harm them. My second question for this morning is one of the threats that the Coptic community is likely to face under the weight of Islamist dominance in Egypt's new socio-political realities. I must begin with the caveat that it does a disservice to the Coptic cause to exaggerate this to genocidal levels. As of today, at least, Egypt is not Iraq, which has faced massive violence and mass migration of a majority of its Christians over the last decade. And it is not 7th century North Africa. Thank goodness for that. But the Copts do face real and imminent threats from newfound Islamist power, obviously from the Muslim Brotherhood, and these threats are bad enough. The current generation of Islamist leadership, including the high ranks of the Muslim Brotherhood, and from whose order emerged the newly elected President Mohamed Morsi, has remained infamously vague in the international press and in its various electoral programs about its specific intentions toward the Copts. Their empty promises of a better future for Egypt belie the thoroughly illiberal, profoundly troubling, and deeply rooted ideological commitment of the Brotherhood to institute a progressively harsher form of Islamic jurisprudence, indeed a whole Islamist way of life, throughout Egyptian state and society. Those pressures are likely to encourage more and more Christians to simply pack up and leave Egypt, especially if they are enacted in conjunction with a persistent or escalated atmosphere of legal impunity for those who attack Copts, such as the violence in Seoul, in Merinab, in Mbaba, or for that matter in Maspero last year. More than anything, this potential flight from Egypt to the US, to Australia, to Europe, threatens the very future of the Coptic Christian presence within its Egyptian homeland. To my final question, how can and should the foreign policy of the United States and its allies respond to this set of circumstances, especially given what threatens to be our waning influence in Egypt? First, and briefly, they can speak up. Not to demand that Egyptians fulfill the will of the United States, but that they fulfill their own promises, their own rhetoric of right and equality. And this knowledge is crucial, and merely shedding a bright light on the dark corners of abuse against the Copts is one of the best tools at our disposal. Second, we must remember that just less than half of the country's electorate voted against Mohamed Morsi, against the Muslim Brotherhood, in the presidential runoff. The United States should find ways to sensitively support, encourage, and draw attention to the millions of Muslim and Coptic Egyptians who seek a better future for their country than the oppression that Islamism will offer. We must find ways to support this 49%. After all, while the Copts will be the most vulnerable under Islamist pressure, we must recognize they will not be alone in this plight. Journalists, authors, scholars, public intellectuals, perhaps even religious figures will become easy targets of apostasy and blasphemy laws if they espouse ideas and stances that challenge the ideological supremacy of Islamic jurisprudence. We do still maintain a financial and diplomatic stake in Egypt's fortunes. The United States has repeatedly declared its commitment to democratic reform in Egypt. Fine. But it must also be clear and far more explicit in drawing a red line in front of religious freedom as an essential human right in Egypt, represented by the full equality and citizenship of the Copts.
Before I begin, I want to take a moment to remember His All Holiness Pope Shenouda. He was instrumental in this search. He was instrumental, as you know, in the search for mutual understanding among the world's religions. I express my deepest condolences for your loss and pray that a worthy successor will arise. A successor who will protect the oldest Christians in the Middle East and prevent the persecution of religious minorities. As you know, I've worked to condemn violations of religious freedom throughout the world. As a member of the Subcommittee on the Middle East, and of course in the Religious Freedom Caucus, I'm alarmed especially at the dwindling number of Christians in the Middle East. A good friend of mine, Carolyn Glick, wrote in the Jerusalem Post in a column this issue, actually it's been a couple months. She noted that in Turkey, the Christian population has dwindled from 2 million at the end of World War I to less than 100,000 today. Unacceptable. And there are only 1,200 Greek Orthodox Christians left in Constantinople, a place that refuses to recognize the ecumenical patriarch, the nature of our patriarch, my patriarch, Bartholomew. Additionally, the theological school at Halki, a seminary to train Orthodox clergy, has been shut down for over 40 years. Again, unacceptable. and this behavior by the Turkish government must stop. In Iraq, a decade ago, there were 800,000 Christians. Today, there are 150,000 Christians. And Iran, prior to the Islamic Revolution, Iran's Christians were more or less free to practice their religion. Today, they are executed. What a shame. In Syria, 4 decades ago, Christians made up nearly half of the population. Today, 4% of Syrians are Christian, and they are suffering currently during a tragic time, of course, as you know, and please include them, I know you will, in your prayers. In Jordan, half a century ago, 18% of the population was Christian. Today, 2% of Jordanians are Christian. And of course, we all know the horrible massacre, persecution of Egyptian Copts.
A number of years, months ago, I got a bill passed that sets up a special envoy to advocate for Christians and religious minorities in the Middle East. We see that this is not a big issue for this administration, and we see the religious minorities, whether it be the Coptic Christians, and there's an all-time record of political asylum requests that we're seeing, but we also see the Iraqi, Chaldean, Syrian Christians who live in fear. They basically speak the same language of Jesus. America goes over there, and now we see in Baghdad, Canyon White and all live in fear. We have nuns up from Nineveh and places like that to say they live in fear. We have Iraqi Christian women in Damascus and Lebanon living in ghettos, and nobody is kind of saying anything about it. So we want to see advocate for in the government. And keep in mind, for those of you who are Christian and who look at the Bible, more biblical activity took place in Iraq and Egypt than any other countries other than Israel. In Iraq, Abraham is from Iraq. Esther, for such a time like this, from Iraq. Daniel was buried in Kirkuk in Iraq. Nineveh, Jonah, and we see the Iraqi Christian community being eradicated. We see Shahbaz Bhatti, who is a Christian member of the Pakistani parliament, advocate and talk about his faith in Jesus, and all of a sudden, about a month later, gunned down as he's leaving his mother's house. So we need somebody in this administration and somebody in the next administration, until all discrimination goes away, which I don't see that day coming, someone there that you have a place to go, that your groups will have a place to go, somebody who's not just a weak, milquetoast person, but somebody who's an advocate for, who will stand up and speak out, who really believes it. And so we passed it in the House, 401 to 20 or 21 in the Senate. It's non-controversial, but now it's tied up. One senator has a hold on it. One senator has a hold on it. We see the Christian community in Syria living in fear. We see the Coptic Christians worried with regard to what does the future hold with regard to this new government. We see the Iraqi Chaldean Christians, we see nuns coming out of Nineveh worried and fearful. We see the Ahmadis in Pakistan being blown up and gunned down in their mosques. We see Baha'is in Egypt came in to get his driver's license. We see Baha'is in Iran literally living in fear and many in prison. Well, there's one senator who has a hold on it. So if there's a challenge, I urge you to contact Senator Webb's office, but also contact your own senator's office. And I understand, to say the good things about somebody, Harry Reid is for it. So contact Senator Reid, the majority leader, and ask them to move this bill. So we have one person who will be advocate for, who we know will be there in the inner circles of you, will always advocating for Christians and religious minorities in the Middle East. And my commitment is, as long as I have this opportunity, I will advocate and speak out and do. Be vigilant, but lastly, come back to where I began. This must be an issue in the presidential race. Both candidates must lay out for us what they will do with regard to religious persecution and human rights. We want to hear from them. And if they all want to be out of the mantle and be like Ronald Reagan, then to advocate and speak out, remember it again. Reagan said those words in the Constitution that we all revere were a covenant with the entire world. That's a covenant for the people in Upper Egypt, that's a cover for the people in Cairo, the people in Nineveh Plains, the people in Lahore, the people all over. Please, and help us get that bill out of the Senate. Thank you very much.
We've called on the new government to uphold universal rights found in the Universal Rights of Human Declaration of Human Rights that recognizes that everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. And this right includes the freedom to change one's religion or belief, and freedom, either alone or in community with others, and in public or in private, to manifest one's religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. So we've called on the new government to uphold these universal values. And we also share Coptic Bishop Angelos's recent sentiment, where he said that this election is a new step in the process of change, and that this is the time in Egypt to become a nation that does not focus on a person's religious or political stance, but more on his or her contribution and accountability to a single nation and equality before the law.
Among the many things that are now in flux in Egypt is the process for developing, writing a new constitution. The Constituent Assembly, the second iteration of a Constituent Assembly is now meeting, but there are two clouds hanging over the process. One is a court case which has now been extended until September, which challenges the legitimacy of the Constituent Assembly, and a second is a declaration by the SCAF, by the military, that they hold the right to dissolve and reconstitute the Constituent Assembly. It is critically important, vitally important, that the Coptic Christian community has a voice in the new Constitution, and that the Constitution protect religious and other minorities as a fundamental human rights principle.
The question is, what real actions are you going to do relative to... If you give promises, we know they have no credibility and the history is very obvious. And what about also today, the woman who cannot walk in the street without veil?
I believe that women need to be empowered in Egypt. They need to have a role in political and social life, and they need to be involved in drafting the Constitution and moving forward. That's what democratic societies that succeed do. When it comes to the role of religion, it's critical that there be a space for every religious group to practice their religion freely. Those are the discussions we're having. It is not an easy discussion, but I think from your perspective and from ours, it's critical that we be in there in a straightforward way, saying there are principles of universal human rights that demand, that guarantee religious freedom for all. That's the starting point. Now, what should the Coptic community do? You should do exactly what you're doing. I'm not going to give you, a list, but obviously you live in a free society here where people's voices are heard, and you have an important community, as you say. You're being here. We're sitting in the Capitol. You're obviously able to express your concerns, and that's part of the American system. It's part of why our system works. So I'm not going to give you the prescription of what to say to who, but I would encourage you to be engaged on all fronts, and that includes us. The more we hear from you, the more we have a sense specifically, these are things that are happening that we need to be attentive to. It makes it easier for us to do our job.
One of the things that you've got to remember, you're not alone in this fight. It doesn't matter if you're Christian, it doesn't matter if you're Jew, it doesn't matter if you're Muslim. There's elements in those communities that are persecuted. Now I'm going to ask the question, does anybody know any Muslim community that's been persecuted? Yes, sir. Sorry, did somebody say the 73rd sect of Islam, the Ahmadis in Pakistan? His Holiness here is in town today? Okay. Shiites? You're not alone. Does anybody know what happened in 2008, August, in Kandahar, Larissa? 176 churches, 40,000 people were interned, and none was raped, and 170 people were killed. I went there, and I visited. And I asked the people, I said, why are you in these camps? They said, we're scared to go back home. They were not scared from Muslims, they were scared from fundamental Hindus. And then I spoke in New Delhi in a conference called The Enemy Within. And I said, the enemy within is fundamentalism. I don't care if it's Christian, I don't care if it's Hindu, I don't care what it is. So fundamentalism, be it Coptic, be it Greek Orthodox, be it Roman Catholic, whatever it is, separate us and divides us. And I've seen cops that are adamant, they say, man, and I go, hold on a second here. Hold on. Just back up for 30 seconds. And I've seen Greeks that are adamant. And I go, hold on. There's a Greek Muslim minority in the north of Greece, and I visited in 1995. And I sort of turned around and I asked my fellow Greek politician, I said, how can you allow the people to live like this? And they said, well, they did it to our people. So just because somebody does it to you, that doesn't mean you got to do it to the other. However, we got to go back a little bit in history. In 1914, 1917, the Ottoman Empire, which is today Turkey, started the first and the second genocide of the 20th century. First they started with Greeks, Pontians, and then they went with Armenians. And 350,000 Greek Pontians were executed, killed, women raped, and 1.5 million Armenians. And we figured that we learned.
150,000 Syrians too.
Thank you. And we figured that we learned. And then Hitler in 1939 in August said, when he was ready, just about to do his final solution, he says, who remembers the Armenian genocide? Folks, today we're talking about it. The House of Commons in Canada recognized the Armenian genocide. We're working on other issues. I'm Greek myself, and we're working on the Pontian genocide, and we have to address the Syrian genocide and the Assyrians and what's happening today in Iraq and all over the world. However, you're not alone in this fight. And this is where I'm going to ask you to sort of think out of the box. It's great for politicians to come and say, I represent you, and I'm going to go vote for you, and I'm going to go speak for you. But folks, we say this because we want your votes. We say this because we want your money. Now, it's a little different up in Canada about financial and what electoral expenses. We can only spend $85,000 for our elections, for our federal election. Down here, the numbers are a little different. Now, we just had an election in Egypt, and maybe the results are not what you wish. And maybe the results could have been a little different. Folks, people of Egypt spoke. Some people said, well, the elections were rigged. Well, you had international monitors. And there's nothing of the sort saying that the elections were rigged coming out. One, we have to congratulate the president-elect. Two, he has made some promises, and he's saying that I am going to have vice presidents, and he also said that I'm going to have a Coptic vice president that's going to have a lot to do with the file. And we have to make sure that, one, we watch what he does, two, we take him at his word, and three, we hold him accountable. And accountability could be through your congressmen, through your members of parliament, through your senators. Accountability could be throughout the world stage. And that can only be done by you, by networking, by making sure that not only is your cause, and you only speak about your cause, but you speak about causes.
My own commitment to this fight stems from a deep belief that all human beings are indeed children of God. And they're created equal, and that the thing that makes them equal is because they are created. That divine spark of God in the soul of every human being, that imago Dei, we would call it, is what creates a brotherhood among all of us that transcends even those areas where we may disagree completely. But this is a principle that stems directly from the founding of our country, and it's enshrined in our Constitution, Declaration of Independence in the United States. And as the chairman of the Constitution Subcommittee and the co-chair of the IRF caucus, I'm deeply committed to promoting human dignity and the innate worth of every human life in America and across the world. Our commitment to religious freedom is not just for one faith community, but for people of all faiths or even no faith around the world. And now is perhaps the most critical time for us to stand together on behalf of religious freedom. Over this last year and a half, we have witnessed a widespread desire for democracy throughout the Arab Spring that has exposed the latent instability of regimes that suppress human freedom. But one of the freedoms that is a great litmus test for the stability of any nation is also one of the most overlooked freedoms, and of course that is the freedom of religion. Other universally recognized fundamental human rights and freedoms such as freedom of conscience and belief, assembly, freedom of speech, these are all profoundly diminished when religious freedom is restricted.
Copts aren't being protected, and Copts must be protected, along with every other member of Egyptian society, from attacks on their right to order their lives and practice their beliefs in dignity and peace. So long as Copts and other religious minorities aren't being sufficiently protected, USCIRF will continue to spotlight the problem and recommend that the U.S. government take strong action in support of religious freedom. Our recommendations to the United States government are as follows. First, the United States should press Egypt to improve religious freedom conditions by repealing discriminatory decrees against religious minorities, removing religion from official identity documents, abolishing blasphemy codes, and passing a unified law for the construction and repair of places of worship. Second, the United States should urge Egypt's government to prosecute government-funded clerics, government officials, or any other individuals who incite violence while disciplining or dismissing government-funded clerics who preach intolerance and hatred. Third, the United States should increase pressure on Egypt to bring to justice those who have committed violence against fellow Egyptians on account of their religion. Fourth, Washington should press Cairo to include robust protections for religious freedom in a new constitution. Fifth, the U.S. Congress should require the Departments of State and Defense to report every 90 days on the Egyptian government's progress pertaining to religious freedom and related rights. You know, one thing we found over the years when you work in the field of human rights, religious freedom, is the evildoers, those who are perpetrating these wrongs against religious communities, sort of hope the rest of us to be lulled into a state of disinterest and unawareness. The last thing they want is vigilance and attention and constant renewal of the spotlight. So we think that this 90-day time frame would be one that essentially would say, your feet are never going to be not held to the fire. We're on this all the time. Sixth, until genuine progress occurs, USCIRF renews its call for the United States to designate Egypt as a country of particular concern. Thank you. You know, for many, many years, we have seen in the human rights movement broadly that unless we hold up to shame and to account those who are not living up to the standards, the international standards outlined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, unless we make their lives uncomfortable, we will not get their attention. We will not have the momentum to bring about change. So we're glad for your support for that call. And we call for this designation of Egypt as a country of particular concern because it is one of the world's most serious religious freedom abusers. And finally, if Egypt demonstrates a commitment to progress on freedom of religion and related rights, the United States should ensure that a portion of its military aid to Egypt be used to help Egypt's police implement a plan to enhance protection for religious minorities and their places of worship. Today, as Egypt confronts the rigors of democratic transition, will it uphold the rights of Copts and other religious minorities? The world is watching, and USERF is watching too.
The changes in Egypt, I believe, are a wake-up call for the West and for the Middle East as far as pathologies that have existed there for a long time that are now, through these convulsions, beginning to become understood. And unfortunately, the Middle East has been struggling between two evils, secular fascism of the Mubaraks and Jamal Abdel Nasser's and Assad's, as those of us from Syria know, versus theocracy and the Islamic rule of Saudi Arabia or Iran. And unfortunately, both, I think, are two sides of the same coin, but use different ways. The problem, though, is that the secular fascists never had popular support. They had military control. The Islamists have some significant popular support and are an ideological movement. And the premise of my remarks are that you cannot defeat an ideological movement without countering the ideology. Simply, unfortunately, I believe, as much as the defense of religious freedom is a wonderful premise, it's still basically a defensive posture. It's a posture that basically looks for problems and identifies them, rather than treating the source from which the religious freedom abuses come. And I will tell you that ultimately, it is within our purview to endorse and back the reformers and those that are fighting within societies. And I think there can be no better coalitions formed. And I think if you look at the struggle and recontextualize it for yourselves, in every one of these countries where you see Islamists, whether Jamaat Islami in Egypt or Muslim Brotherhood or the Jamaat Islami of Pakistan or the Wahhabis and Salafis, these are all revivalists with various flavors. And I'd say the Salafists, Al-Azhar, and Muslim Brotherhood are various flavors of political Islam 2.0, 3.0, or 4.0. At the end of the day, they derive their energy from a revivalism of Islam. Versus the reformers that can often be very devout Muslims, such as in our organization, the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, that believes very intently in our belief in God and our practice of our personal faith, as you heard from Congressman Franks. But at the end of the day, law should come from God and not from Islam or from our faith. And I think some may view that as a nuance, but ultimately I believe that's the only way. And when you look at solutions in Egypt, yes, I understand the desire of the Copts to possibly form their own political party, but I think actually that will feed into some of the sectarian issues. And as much as that might be able to protect and again build a defensive posture, something that would be much more potent would be to form coalitions under exactly what does it mean to be Egyptian. And that when you define what it means to be Egyptian, then you develop a constitution that is under God, under shared values that are universal and humanitarian, rather than under one narrative, which is what Al-Azhar, the Brotherhood, and the Salafists especially want to do. And I think ultimately some may view it as, and when we look at Islamism as this deer in headlights approach that we've had to it, we just sort of become paralyzed. I think ultimately we have then, as a result, said, well, we're submitting to it and surrender. We just want to figure out how to massage it or mollify it so that at least it's not as bad. And we'll set up benchmarks to make sure that they're doing these things. And I guess that's one approach. But why not work from within, inside the House of Islam, with the reformers, the ones that are pushing back against the revivalists? And the ideas of organizations like ours did not come out of a vacuum. And ultimately, our ideas come from many Muslims, and I think Egypt is now ground zero in this battle against Islamism, as much for the Sunni community, as much as Iran has been ground zero for the Shia community, as far as their battle against theocracy.
One of the failures that I see happened in our foreign policy here in dealing with radical Islam or Islamism in general is the inability to recognize that what happens there can affect us here. In the late 70s, many of you probably remember very well the rising of Islamism and the what's called the Sahwa al-Islamiyya, the revival of Islam that happened after Wahhabism and Petro-Islam, and all of this started to grow. And after this, at some stage, we started to see discrimination against Christians, discrimination against liberal and enlightened Muslims. You remember Farak Fouda, for example. He was a Muslim and he was killed just because of his views and opinions. That's why what the message I want to convey to every Copt here is that, number one, they are not alone. This is number one. Number two, the threat is not only limited to them, it's really affecting liberal Muslims and enlightened people and all humanity, not just them. And this is what the US administration missed in this particular issue, that when you underestimate the life of humans in a place like Egypt, when you see the Islamists considering anyone who convert, they should kill him, for example, or the life of a non-Muslim is inferior to the life of a Muslim in the jurisprudence, as many teach under Sharia. When you underestimate human life somewhere in the world, it can affect you at the end. What happened? The same mentality that underestimated human life there traveled to Afghanistan and caused the attack on the Twin Towers here that costed America trillions of dollars and thousands of innocent people were killed. This can tell us a really an important lesson. You cannot just ignore what happens there. Your policy, or the US policy, must consider that the phenomena of radical Islam is not geographically located. The ideas that are generated there, that underestimate human life and allow killing of innocents or using brutality against them, can affect us here at the end. And that is why, at the policy level, there is a need for a change from a reactive approach to evil to proactive approach. We cannot wait anymore to be attacked again. We cannot wait anymore until this disease proliferates and affects every part of the world. The military, despite all its mistakes, we talk about Maspero, people talk about Muhammad Mahmoud similarly, we can say there is some element of rough dealing with people. However, if the military is weakened now, this will not be replaced by civilians. This is one of the worst, the things that we need to understand. In Egypt, we are not divided into military and civilians. We are divided into military, civilians, and Islamists. That is the reality of it. Delivering full power to civilians is fine and great. However, delivering full power to Islamists can create barbaric dictatorship and fascism that will be much worse than any military dictatorship. So I still fully support, if I have the choice, a secular military is certainly better and easier to deal with them than a fascism like the Salafists and the radicals, who really does not respect the right of others to exist with them as citizens and respect them as equal human beings.